Clear to play.
In this video, we are going to cover the assault phase. I've decided to dedicate a video by itself to this one because the assault phase is probably the most complicated phase out of all three. Movement phase is pretty straightforward. Shooting phase can get complicated a little bit based on the weapons that you're firing. But in the assault phase, both sides get to act. And you're going to see exactly how that works. So I've decided that the best tactic for these Chaos Cultists is both to charge the same squad of Tactical Marines. And the reason I've decided this is because Chaos Cultists aren't very good individually, but they're very strong as a group. So if I decide to split only half of them going there and the other half going there, the Tactical Marines are going to be able to beat back the Cultists no problem. The second reason is because both of these have already fired the squad, and you can only declare an assault against something that you have fired on. So the order of operations here is that we first pick a unit and declare who they are going to assault. So we're going to start with this smaller unit of cultists and say they are going to assault these Tactical Marines. Now the first thing that happens when I declare an assault is that the player who owns the Tactical Marines decides if they want to do something called Overwatch. Overwatch is basically firing your weapons at the people who are assaulting you. It's not as effective as regular shooting, but it's better than nothing. It might mean that you get a couple casualties. The reason they might not want to decide to overwatch against this squad is because if this squad fails to actually get there, they could overwatch against another target. You can only overwatch once per unit per assault phase. But they're definitely going to want to overwatch these. So overwatch works almost exactly the same as shooting. So we measure to see how many shots we get. In this case, everything is within 12 inches. So we're going to get 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 shots. Remember, bolters fire twice when they are within 12 inches. So they're going to fire 9 times. But unlike regular shooting, we do what's called a snapshot. A snapshot is just a quick shot, which means that it's not as accurate. So no matter what your ballistic skill is, it is reduced to 1. And 7 minus 1 is 6, which means you only hit on 6s. So it's not quite as powerful as regular shooting, but hey, you might as well take it. It's a free shot. So we're going to roll their 9 shots. And they manage 1, 6. So all these other ones miss, which is quite typical because rolling 6s is not very easy. But the rolling for wounding and armor works exactly the same. So the strength of the bolter is 4, the toughness of the cultist is 3. When we look up the chart in Warhammer 40k rulebook, we see that we need to roll 3+ in order to wound. But we fail with a 2. So unfortunately nothing happens. If I had managed to wound, the wounding would work exactly the same way that we take it from the front of the squad. So if you actually do manage to remove models, that means that their charge distance is going to have to be larger. Because now that that is resolved, we now roll to see how far the Chaos Cultists manage to charge. Now let's just pre-measure this to see how far they need to go. And the closest distance is over 7 inches. So we're going to have to roll 8 or higher. You roll 2d6, in other words 2 6-sided dice, and that determines how far you can charge. We managed to roll an 8, which is just barely what we need. If we had rolled less than 8, then the charge would have failed and the Chaos Cultists would not move at all. So now that we've rolled that, they move 8 inches. And they have to move into base contact if they possibly can. So when assaulting, you take the closest model and you move them in a straight line to the closest enemy model. You then choose the next model and you move them in a straight line, trying to get in base contact with a model that is unengaged. We then take another one and we move him as far as we can. Now he's more than 8 inches away from this model that is unengaged. So that means that he can either go to another model that's within 8 inches or just move up as far as he can. In this case, nothing was within 8 inches. So he's just going to move up his 8, which makes him come a little shy. And then we move the next model 8 inches, moving as close as we possibly can. You can't decide to leave your guys back out of combat. And then we move on to the next declaration of an assault. So we have this squad. They are going to declare an assault against the Space Marine Tactical Marines, the same squad that was just charged. Because this squad is already engaged in close combat, and because they've already done Overwatch, they don't get to fire Overwatch again. So we just go straight to the point where we determine how far they're able to move. So we roll 7, which means they can move up to 7 inches, which should be plenty for these. Once again, we take the closest model and we move it up 7 inches. Then we take the next one. We try to get in base contact, but obviously that's not going to happen because they're further away. Now it can get a little complicated when we have multiple combats going on, because it can get hard to determine which squad is which. So we just have to remember that these 6 are one squad, and these 8 are another squad. We'll just have to keep track of that. Now that all the assaults have been declared, all the Overwatch shots have been fired, and all the moves have been made, we now move into what's called the fight subphase. And this is where both players get to actually fight each other. The fighting in close combat is determined by several things. First off, to see who gets to actually strike their blows first, you look at the initiative of the models. Space Marines typically have an initiative of 4, and the Chaos Cultists have an initiative of 3. Because the Space Marines' initiative is higher, they get to go first. If they had the same initiative, then they'd go at the same time, meaning that you just choose one side to go first, but if they manage to kill anything, those still get to strike back, even though they're technically dead. But the Space Marines go first. The very first thing you do once you get to your initiative, which is initiative 4 in this case, is you do a pile-in move. What that means is any models that are not in base contact with an enemy must move up to 3 inches in an effort to get into base contact with an enemy. So in here, we take this model, and he has to move up to 3 inches to get in base contact. So he can move and engage this model right here. Then we have this guy, so he needs to move up 3 inches to engage this model right here, keeping in mind that there has to be room for his base to move through. If they can't get in base contact, then they just need to move up as close as possible. Next, we now make our attacks. Now, because this is a multiple combat, we actually have to roll separately for each squad that we are fighting. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 guys who are fighting this squad, and we have 1 guy who is fighting this squad. So we'll do that right now. Any model that is in base contact, or that is within 2 inches of a model that is in base contact, is able to strike. So if after moving, this model back here was actually right here, because he's within 2 inches of a model that is in base contact, he would still get to fight. So you can actually end up having a bunch of models piled back who are all able to fight. So let's start with these 4. Next, in order to see how many attacks they get, you look at the number of attacks in their profile, and that is under A for attacks in their profile. The Space Marines only have 1 each, except for the Sergeant, who has 2. The Sergeant has one more special thing to think about. Because he is armed with a chain sword and a bolt pistol, he actually gets an extra attack in close combat. Now that's more special rules that we can probably cover in another video, but if you look under the close combat weapons in the 40k rulebook, you'll see which weapons confer additional attacks. So the total number of attacks that we have is 1, 2, 3, plus 3 from the Sergeant. So he hits 3 times while these other guys are just hitting once. So that's a total of 6 attacks. So we're going to take 6 dice. And we're going to roll to hit just like in the shoot phase. Except this time, instead of just taking your skill, you're going to compare your weapon skill with the weapon skill of the models you are striking. Now in the case of the Space Marines, they have a weapon skill of 4. And the Cultists have a weapon skill of 3. There's a chart once again in the Warhammer 40k rulebook that you compare these two to see what you need to roll. But I've already looked it up, and a weapon skill of 4 versus a weapon skill of 3 means that the Space Marines will hit on a 3+. So here they manage to strike 4 blows. Now to determine if they wound them, we have to roll again, just like in the shooting phase. But this time we're not comparing the strength of the weapon, we're comparing the strength of the model. The strength of a Space Marine is 4, which just coincidentally happens to be the same strength of their bolt weapons. And the toughness of the Cultists we already know to be 3, because it's the same toughness that you use in the shooting phase. So we look at strength 4 versus toughness 3 in the Warhammer 40k rulebook, and we see that you need to roll a 3+ in order to deal a wound. So we got 4 hits, and we managed to score 3 wounds. Then once again we move to the armor saves of the models. Now in this case, since we're not firing the bolt guns, the regular close combat attacks of the Space Marines don't have any armor penetration capabilities. So the Cultists actually get to roll for their 6+ armor save. So they were struck down 3 times, so they roll 3 dice, and unfortunately they did not roll any 6s, which means 3 of the Chaos Cultists will die. Once again, we always choose models that are closest, and since these 3 are all in base contact, they will definitely be the closest. So 1, 2, 3 die. Now I'm going to put these right here because we need to keep track of how many die. because that is important for the combat resolution. Now the Space Marines aren't done yet. We still have this tactical Marine who has to fight against this squad. But he only has one attack, and he's going to hit on 3, just like the other ones. He manages a hit, and then he is going to wound on a 3 as well. And he rolls a 1 and fails. Now it is the Chaos Cultist turn, because now we're done initiative 4, so now we go down to initiative 3. So the first thing we do is we do the pile in move. So we move up to 3 inches to try to get in base contact. So he will move up to 3 inches, 3 inches, and he will move 3 inches, and then 3 inches. And these ones won't be able to get in base contact, so they're just going to try to get as close as they possibly can. Only moving 3 inches, of course. So because the cultists all have the same weapon stats, and because they're all fighting something that has the same toughness and armor save, we can actually roll for all of these cultists together. Because if these guys manage to strike a blow and kill over here, we do technically have to remove this model, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So normally, if you were in a tournament and it really mattered which model died, you'd want to do these guys first, because if they kill guys, these 2 are the ones that have to die first. And if these 3 kill guys, then these 3 are the first that have to die. But I'm not too worried about that. Most of the time you just want to have fun, so let's roll as many dice as we possibly can. So, how many cultists are attacking? Well, every single one that's in base contact, which is 6, plus every one that is within 2 inches of one that is in base contact. And if we measure that, that's all of them. So we've got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now, on top of that, Chaos Cultists are actually, they strike more blows in close combat than the Tactical Marines. The reason for this is twofold. One, they are by default armed with a close combat weapon and an auto pistol. And we always find that a close combat weapon coupled with a pistol gives you +1 attack. So base stats, these guys only have 1 attack each, but they get +1 each for having the close combat weapon. But there's one more thing that gives them more attacks, and that is that they were the ones that initiated the charge. And if you're the ones that initiated the charge, then for that assault phase, not any others, you get +1 attack. So these cultists are actually going to strike at 3 attacks each, which is a very large number. This is why they wanted to get in close combat, because they knew that if they charged, they get a lot of attacks. So when we're looking at our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 cultists, we're actually going to get 33 attacks. And we already know that the weapon skill of the Chaos Cultists is 3, and the weapon skill of the Space Marines is 4. When we look at the chart and compare 3 to 4, we find that the cultists need to roll 4 or higher in order to hit the Space Marines. So you can see that the Space Marines are highly skilled, which is why there's less of them. They would hit on 3s and wound on 3s, and the cultists are going to hit on 4s, and then we're going to find that they're going to have to wound on 5s, just like before. So let's roll. See, they've got lots of dice here, 33 attacks. Let's re-roll these 3, make sure they're on the table. And they hit on 4s. So I'm just going to remove all the misses. They actually rolled really well here. Normally with a 4+, you're going to make half of your attacks. But this is clearly more than half. So that's how many a number of attacks that we actually managed to strike with. So now we compare the strength of the cultists, which is 3, against the toughness of the Space Marines, which is 4. Look at the table in the Warhammer 40k rulebook. We see that they need a 5 or higher in order to wound. So even though they're rolling more dice, they actually need to in order to make up for the fact that they need to roll higher. So how many wounds are they going to inflict? Now we only need 5, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not bad, but actually not very good either. That's a lot of failed wounds. And they need to inflict lots because the Space Marines have very good armor. So now the Space Marines get to roll for their armor save, which we already know to be 3+. And since there's no armor penetration on the close combat weapons of the cultists, we just roll these 5 dice, and for every failed 3+, 1 Space Marine will go down. So 2 of them failed. So 2 Space Marines died. Now you always take the closest, so in this case the Sergeant is safe. And this is where if we had done them individually, you would see, do we have to take from this side or from this side? So just understand that if you're going to do this in a tournament setting, that is important. If you're playing a friendly game, then you want to try to speed it up as fast as possible, which means rolling dice together as often as possible. So we have 2 that have died. So I'm just going to take the 2 from this side. So we're going to leave them right here, just to keep track of each side. Now that the combat is over, we need to resolve it. And the way that you resolve it is to see who won the combat. And the way that you see who won the combat is to look at who inflicted the most casualties. Well, the Space Marines inflicted 3 casualties, and the cultists inflicted only 2, which means the Space Marines won that combat. And what does that mean? It means that the losing side, the cultists, are going to have to make a leadership check in order to see if they run away. And that goes for every squad on the losing side. So in this case, there's 2 squads, so each of them will have to make a leadership check. In this case, I do want to actually go over leadership because it's important in the assault phase, even more important than it is in the shooting phase. So let's get rid of these guys. But we know that the Space Marines inflicted 1 more wound than the cultists did, because they did 3, and then minus 2 is 1. So each squad of cultists has to make a leadership check against their leadership, but with a negative modifier equal to how many they lost by. So they'll have their leadership reduced by 1 because they lost the combat by 1. Now the leadership of a Chaos Cultist is normally 7, but it is reduced to 6 because they lost combat by 1. So to make a leadership check, which we'll cover this in more detail in another video, you take 2 dice, and you have to roll equal to or less than your leadership. So let's start with this squad. They have to roll 6 or less, which they managed to do. So that's actually pretty good. This squad also has to roll 6 or less, which they managed to do. So the cultists are very lucky. At least one of those squads should have broken away. Now, once the combat resolution is done, both sides then get to do what's called a pile-in move. So starting with the player whose turn it is, you move up to 3 inches, just like you would in the fight subphase, where you're trying to get into base contact. So we'll start with this squad, they move to 3 inches. And this other squad moves up to 3 inches as well. So let's start to measure these just to make sure we move as close as we possibly can. Now we have to make sure we don't come into base contact with these guys, because they are not part of this fight. And then the Space Marines get to pile in, but because they are already all in base contact, they're done. Now that it's a Space Marine turn, this combat's going to get even more complicated, and you're going to see why. So we're going to start in the movement phase, just to make sure we do this in the right order. So this squad knows that they want to join this assault. So they're going to turn and move up to 6 inches. They have to stay at least 1 inch away from their enemy. And that's definitely 6 inches. So the movement phase is done, because if you are engaged in close combat, you are not allowed to move. We then go to the shooting phase. Well, the squad that's engaged in close combat cannot shoot, because they're engaged in close combat. And this squad has no targets, because they cannot fire at a squad that is engaged in close combat, because they might hit their friends. Even if you're on the evil side, you're not allowed to fire. So the shooting phase is over, and it's kind of good that they wouldn't shoot anyways, because they want to jump in, and if they fire their rapid fire weapons, well, then they can't assault. So now we go to the assault phase, and so this unit declares a charge against that unit. Now we don't have to worry about Overwatch, because you can't fire Overwatch if you are already engaged in close combat. And so these guys are just going to roll to see how far they can go. Now in this case it's almost arbitrary, because they're within 1 inch, which means even if I rolled a double 1, they're still going to get in close combat. But they get to move up to 7 inches. So we go closest to closest, trying to get into contact with a model that is already, or that is not in base contact with an enemy. And then this one goes, and so he's going to go over here, up to 7 inches, remember. So you can see I'm not bothering to measure because this is clearly within 7 inches. We now move to the fight subphase. Now this is where it gets a little more complicated, and where we are definitely going to do this model by model, or unit by unit. So let's just make a little bit of a division here, because these 3 are a squad, and this group over here is a squad, and this is a squad, and this is a squad. So once again, we go down to the different initiatives. Starting at 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4 is the first one that we actually have in this combat. So since we're at initiative 4 now, that means all the Space Marines get to go first. So let's make this simple. Because I am the controlling player of the Space Marines, I get to decide, because they all have the same initiative, which ones go first. So I'm going to start with this squad over here. Since they are all attacking the same squad, I can do all of their attacks together. So how many attacks will they get? Well, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, plus 3 from the sergeant, so that's 7. However, since these guys charged this assault phase, they get plus 1 attacks each. So that'll give us 5 more attacks. So it's actually going to be 2, 4, 6, 8, plus 4, which gives us 12. So now we take our 12 dice, and we already know from the previous fight that we need to roll 3s in order to hit. And they roll pretty well, only missing with 4 of these. And we know from our previous fight that they only need 3s in order to wound. So we'll roll these together. And they make all of those, which is a lot of hits. Now these cultists have to roll to see if they manage to stop any of those hits with their armor. They only have a 6+ armor save. And they manage to roll 2 6s, so 2 of these wounds are ignored. So we have a total of 6 wounds that are inflicted. And so we always have to take models that are closest. So these 3 are in base contact. Now these 5 are in base contact, I should say. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then these look about the same distance away, so we'll just take this one right here. So that's 6 casualties. We're going to put those 6 casualties right here because we need to keep track of how many casualties the cultists have had. Now that that squad of Space Marines have gone, the other squad gets to make its attacks. Now here we need to split their attacks again because this one is in base contact with this squad and these 2 are in base contact with this squad. So we'll start with this one. He only has 1 attack because he did not charge this assault phase. So he'll strike, hitting on a 3. He hits, and then he strikes, or he tries to wound on a 3, and fails to wound again. Then these 2 get to go. We have 1 attack from him and 3 from the sergeant. Remember, 2 base plus 1 for the close combat weapon. So that's 4 attacks in total. So they get to roll 4, and they make 3 of their hits and 2 of their wounds. So these cultists have to roll to see how much they stop with their armor. And they actually get pretty lucky and make 1 of them. So only 1 of the cultists die. So I have to take the closest one. Now all 3 of these are in base contact, so it's up to me. So I'll take this one, just for fun. And I'll put them over here in this pile to keep track of how many have lost. So now it is the cultist turn. So they have first their pile-in move, which they move up to 3 inches. Only this guy is not in base contact, but he's got to move right here. So that means that these squads have to attack this squad because they are only in base contact. If this guy was right here in base contact with this model could decide if he was going to strike this squad or if he was going to strike this squad. But he's not. So they all have to strike here. And I'll do these separately this time just to make sure they're done right. So the cultists have 1 attack base plus 1 from having a close combat weapon. They do not get their plus 1 attack for charging because that was the last assault phase. So they lose that bonus attack. So these 2 will strike first. So they have 4 attacks in total. They hit on 4s. And they roll pretty average and get 2 hits. And then they wound on 5s. And manage 1 wound. And I get an armor save with the Tactical Marine of 3+ to see if I ignore that wound. And fail it. So here we have to take the model that is closest. Now these 2 were attacking, and they're in base contact with these 2. So I have to choose one of these. I'll just choose this guy, because it doesn't really matter here. And put him over here to keep track of who died. So now these 2 Chaos Cultists get to go. They have 2 attacks each, so they have 4 attacks. So you can see now why I would do these all together sometimes, because it's just faster. And they actually managed to make all 4 hits. And now they're going to roll, see if they wound on a 5+. And they only do 1 wound. So we'll see if these guys can ignore it with a 3+. And they fail as well. Now we have 2 models here. They're both in base contact, so the controlling player gets to decide which one goes away. Obviously I want my sergeant to survive because he's the best, so I will remove this guy and put him over here. For Space Marines, that's actually pretty bad casualties for how few Chaos Cultists got to strike back. But that's why we love the game, because the dice never let you know what's going to happen beforehand. So at the end of this assault phase, we do our combat resolution. So who won the combat? Clearly, the Space Marines won the combat because they only lost 2, but they managed to kill 7, which means they won combat by 5. So when these guys have to make their leadership check, it's going to be -5 to their leadership. Well, their leadership is normally 7, -5 is 2, which means they have to roll double 1. If it ever managed to lower their leadership below 2, a double 1 will always succeed. It's called insane courage. So no matter what you have to roll for leadership, you roll a double 1, you automatically pass. Let's roll for this squad first. Do they manage to get a double 1? Nope, of course not. So they're going to run, which we'll cover in just a second. This squad then tries to see if they'll stay. And they don't manage to stay either, so they're going to run. So let's get these guys out of the way. Now we're going to pretend that in deployment, that table edge over there was the chaos table edge, and this table edge over here is the Space Marine table edge. This is important because when you run directly towards, or as directly towards as you can, your table edge. So we're going to see first off that these guys even manage to run, because you see we have what's called an overrun or sweeping advance. And this is where it's possible that these guys kill the rest of them as they try to run away. The way that you do that is you roll for each side, for each unit, and you add a d6 to their initiative. So let's just do that, and then I'll explain what the result is. So these guys, they have an initiative of 4. So we roll a die, and they get a 1. So that's a total of 5. He has an initiative of 4. He rolls only a 1. So he gets an initiative of 5. These guys have initiative 3. So let's see if these guys can roll. They roll a 4 for a total of 7. And this one only manages to roll a 1 for a total of 4. So what does this mean? Well, if we just change these dice so you know what they rolled. So we got a 5, let's put another die right there, a 7, and a 4. You see that these guys got the highest, and so they're going to get away from these Space Marines. But since he rolled equal to or lower, they are just automatically destroyed. So these two are removed as casualties because they got a sweeping advance done to them by the Space Marine Tactical Marines. So now that we know that these guys get away, we then roll to see how far they go. So just like in normal leadership, which we'll cover in another video, you roll 2 dice, they're going to move 6 inches directly towards their table edge. There's a chance that they'll rally next turn, but not a very good one. Now that they've done that, these guys get to make what's called a consolidation move. And the way you do that is the winner, when there's nobody left, gets to roll a die, and they get to move that far. So for each squad, he gets to move 6 inches, and they get to move 5 inches. And you can do this however you like, but if those cultists were really all that's left, then you'd want to move towards them. So that is the conclusion of the assault phase. We covered a lot of things here. We covered the basic assault, we covered Overwatch, which also covered snapshots, and we covered even multiple assaults to some degree, where there's multiple units involved in the same assault. One thing we didn't cover is one unit assaulting multiple units. But you can look up those rules in the Warhammer 40k rulebook now that you know the basics behind assaulting. Make sure that you leave any comments or questions that you have below, especially if there's future videos that you want me to make in this series. And happy wargaming.